Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 8, These Happy Golden Years. Chapter 9, The Superintendent's Visit. I have only to get through one day at a time, Laura thought when she went into the house. Everything was still all wrong there. Mrs. Brewster did not speak. Johnny was always miserable, and Mr. Brewster stayed at the stable as much as he could. That evening, while she studied, Laura made 4 marks on her notebook for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. She would mark off one of them every night. When they were gone, there would be only 1 week more. Day after day, the weather grew colder again, but still there was no blizzard. The nights passed quietly, though Laura lay half asleep and woke often. Each evening she crossed out a mark. It seemed to make time pass more quickly, to look forward to crossing off one more day. All Wednesday night she heard the wind howling and snow beating on the window. She dreaded that there might be no school next day. But in the morning the sun was shining, though there was no warmth in it. A bitter wind rolled the snow low across the prairie. Laura gladly faced it as she fought her way to the school shanty, breaking her path again. Snow was blowing through the cracks, and once more she let the pupils stand by the stove to study. But slowly the red-hot stove warmed the room, until at recess Laura could hardly see her breath when she blew it above Clarence's back seat. So when she called the school to order, she said, "The room is warmer now. You may take your seats." They were hardly in their places when a sudden knock sounded on the door. Who could it be, she wondered. As she hurried to the door, she glanced through the window, but nothing was to be seen. At the door stood Mr. Williams, the county superintendent of schools. His blanketed teams stood tied to a corner of the school shanty. The soft snow had muffled the sounds of their coming, and they had no bells. This was the test of Laura's teaching, and how thankful she was that the pupils were in their seats. Mr. Williams smiled pleasantly as she gave him her chair by the red-hot stove. Every pupil bent studiously to work, but Laura could feel how alert and tense they were. She was so nervous that it was hard to keep her voice low and steady. It heartened her that each one tried hard to do his best for her. Even Charles made an effort and surpassed himself. Mr. Williams sat listening to recitation after recitation, while the wind blew low and loud and the snow drifted through the cracks in the walls. Charles raised his hand and asked, "Please, may I come to the stove to warm?" Laura said that he might, and without thinking to ask permission, Martha came too. They were studying from the same book. When their hands were warm, they went back to their seat quietly, but without asking permission. It did not speak well for Laura's discipline. Just before noon, Mr. Williams said that he must go. Then Laura must ask him if he wished to speak to the school. "Yes, I do," he answered grimly. And as he rose to his full height of 6 feet, Laura's heart stood still. Desperately, she wondered what she had done that was wrong. With his head nearly touching the ceiling, he stood silent a moment to emphasize what he intended to say. Then he spoke. "Whatever else you do, keep your feet warm." He smiled at them all, and again at Laura, and after shaking her hand warmly, he was gone. At noon, Clarence emptied the coal hod into the stove and went out into the cold to fill it again at the bin. As he came back, he said, "We'll need more coal on the fire before night. It's getting colder fast." They all gathered close to the stove to eat their cold lunches. When Laura called the school to order, she told them to bring their books to the fire. "You may stand by the stove or move about as you please. So long as you are quiet and learn your lessons, we will let that be the rule as long as this cold weather lasts." The plan worked well. Recitations were better than ever before, and the room was quiet while they all studied and kept their feet warm. Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 8, These Happy Golden Years. Chapter 10, Almanzo Says Goodbye. That Saturday at home, Ma was worried about Laura. "Are you coming down with something?" she asked. "It isn't like you to sit half asleep." "I feel a little tired. It isn't anything, Ma," Laura said. Pa looked up from his paper. "That Clarence making trouble again?" "Oh, no, Pa. He's doing splendidly, and they're all as good as can be." She was not exactly lying, but she could not tell them about Mrs. Brewster and the knife. If they knew, they would not let her go back, and she must finish her school. A teacher could not walk away and leave a term of school unfinished. If she did, she would not deserve another certificate, and no school board would hire her. So she made a greater effort to hide from them her sleepiness and her dread of going back to Mrs. Brewster's house. There was only one more week. By Sunday afternoon, the weather had moderated. The temperature was only 15 degrees below zero when Laura and Almanzo set out. There was hardly any wind, and the sun shone brightly. Out of a silence, Laura said, "Only one more week, and I'll be so glad when it's over." "Maybe you'll miss the sleigh rides?" Almanzo suggested. "This one is nice," Laura said, "but mostly it is so cold. I should think you'd be glad not to drive so far anymore. I don't know why you ever started making these long drives. You didn't need to make them to get home the way I do." "Oh, sometimes a fellow gets tired of sitting around," Almanzo replied. "Two old bachelors get pretty dull by themselves." "Why, there are lots of people in town. You and your brother needn't stay by yourselves," Laura said. "There hasn't been anything going on in town since the school exhibition," Almanzo objected. "All a fellow can do is hang around the saloon playing pool or in one of the stores watching the checker players. Sometimes he'd rather be out with better company, even if it does get cold driving." Laura had not thought of herself as good company. If that was what he wanted, she thought, she should make an effort to be more entertaining. But she could not think of anything entertaining to say. She tried to think of something while she watched the sleek brown horses trotting so swiftly. Their dainty feet spurred the snow in perfect rhythm, and their blue shadows flew along the snow beside them. They were so gay, tossing their heads to make a chiming of bells, pricking their ears forward and back, lifting their noses to the breeze of their speed that rippled their black manes. Laura drew a deep breath and exclaimed, "How beautiful!" "What is beautiful?" Almanzo asked. "The horses. Look at them," Laura answered. At that moment, Prince and Lady touched noses as though they whispered to each other. Then together they tried to break into a run. When Almanzo had gently but firmly pulled them into a trot again, he asked, "How would you like to drive them?" "Oh," Laura cried. But she had to add honestly, "Pa won't let me drive his horses. He says I'm too little and would get hurt." "Prince and Lady wouldn't hurt anybody," Almanzo said. "I raised them myself. But if you think they're beautiful, I wish you could have seen the first horse I ever raised, Starlight. I named him for the white star on his forehead." His father had given him Starlight as a colt back in New York State when he was 9 years old. He told Laura all about gentling Starlight and breaking him and what a beautiful horse he was. Starlight had come west to Minnesota, and when first Almanzo came out to the western prairies, he had come riding Starlight. Starlight was 9 years old then, when Almanzo rode him back to Marshall, Minnesota, 105 miles in one day. And Starlight came in so fresh that he tried to race another horse at the journey's end. "Where is he now?" Laura asked. "At a pasture on Father's farm back in Minnesota," Almanzo told her. "He's not as young as he used to be, and I need a double team for driving out here, so I gave him back to Father." The time had passed so quickly that Laura was surprised to see the Brewsters ahead. She tried to keep up her courage, but her heart sank. "What makes you so quiet or so sudden?" Almanzo asked. "I was wishing we were going in the other direction," Laura said. "We'll be doing that next Friday." He slowed the horses. "We can delay it a little," he said, and she knew that somehow he understood how she dreaded going into the house. "Till next Friday, then," he smiled encouragingly as he drove away. Day by day and night by night, the week went by, until there was only one more night to get through. Tomorrow was Friday, the last day of school. When that one night and one day were over, she would go home to stay. She so dreaded that something might happen this last night. Often she woke with a start, but all was quiet and her heart slowly ceased thumping. Friday's lessons were unusually well learned, and every pupil was carefully well behaved. When afternoon recess was over, Laura called the school to order and said there would be no more lessons. School would be dismissed early because this was the last day. She knew that she must make some closing speech to the school, so she praised them all for the work they had done. "You have made good use of the opportunity you had come to school," she told them. "I hope that each of you can get more schooling, but if you cannot, you can study at home as Lincoln did.
An education is worth striving for, and if you cannot have much help in getting one, you can each help yourself to an education if you try. Then she gave Ruby one of her name cards of thin, pale pink cardboard with a spray of roses and cornflowers curving above her printed name. On the back she had written, "Presented to Ruby Brewster by her teacher with kind regards, Brewster School, February 1883. Tommy was next, then Martha and Charles and Clarence. They were all so pleased. Laura let them have a moment to enjoy looking at the pretty cards and carefully placed them in their books. Then she told them to make ready their books, slates, and pencils to carry home. For the last time, she said, "School is dismissed." She'd never been more surprised than she was then, for instead of putting on their wraps as she expected, they all came up to her desk. Martha gave her a beautiful red apple. Ruby shyly gave her a little cake that her mother had baked for her gift. And Tommy and Charles and Clarence each gave her a new pencil that he had carefully sharpened for her. She hardly knew how to thank them, but Martha said, "It's us, we, that thank you, Miss Ingalls. Thank you for helping me with grammar." "Thank you, Miss Ingalls," Ruby said. "I wish it had frosting on it." The boys did not say anything, but after they had all said goodbye and gone, Clarence came back. Standing by Laura's table and leaning against it, he looked down at his cap in his hands and muttered, "I'm sorry I was so mean." "Why, Clarence, that's all right," Laura exclaimed. "And you've done wonderfully well in your studies. I'm proud of you." He looked at her with his old saucy grin and shot out of the room, slamming the door so that the shanty shook. Laura cleaned the blackboard and swept the floor. She stacked her books and papers and shut the drafts of the stove. Then she put on her hood and coat and stood at the window waiting until the sleigh bells came jingling and Prince and Lady stopped at the door. School was out. She was going home to stay. Her heart was so light that she felt like singing with the sleigh bells, and as fast as the horses trotted, they seemed slow. "You won't get there any faster pushing," Almanzo said once, and she laughed aloud to find that she was pushing her feet hard against the cutter's dashboard. But he did not talk much, and neither did she. It was enough to be going home. Not until she had thanked him nicely and said good night and was in the sitting room taking off her wraps did she remember that he had not said good night. He had not said, "I'll see you Sunday afternoon," as he had always said before. He had said, "Goodbye." Of course, she thought, it was goodbye. This had been the last sleigh ride.